It's time to set the record queer. Pantsing, plotting, plantsing, and shortsing are all valid ways to write. Welcome to Setting the Record Queer, a podcast where queer people talk about the pursuits and communities they love. This is episode 29, and it's about science fiction writing. My name is Alexis, my pronouns are it, and she, her, and I'm one of your hosts.
My name's Kaylee, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm your other host. Wow, Alexis, Speedrun Ragnarok sure did happen in the week after this is being recorded, but before people are listening to this.
Yep, it sure is in the past now, obviously, because that's how time works.
It went some well. What I will say is that if you missed it, and you want to see us doing a dub of Yu-Gi-Oh!, you can go through the backlogs of that on Twitch.
Yeah, definitely do. I'm sure it was the highlight of the event. See, that I can say genuinely, because there is no possible way any nerdy speedrunning garbage could possibly outplay literally just doing a live screen reading of Yu-Gi-Oh! Like, no way. Not possible. No way.
I can't believe that we raised
$13,000
and had over
400
viewers. Just need to edit into the blanks the correct numbers.
We'll definitely do that, totally.
Definitely
For sure.
Won't just be 3 blanks in the episode.
For sure. We here on Setting the Record Queer are known for being very good at remembering things, like announcing the name of our next guest more than 24 hours before recording. We're super good at that. On the ball. You might as well call us Remembering the Record Queer, because, we remember everything.
Hey, I'll have you know we posted it 25 hours before we're recording this.
Thank you for proving my point. 25 is, in fact, a bigger number than 24. Well, that was a bit. Kaylee and I were talking about earlier, once again, it feels like it's been forever since we've recorded, but it has in fact been less than 2 weeks this time. So I'm pretty sure time is just fake at this point.
We've been busy. We did a speed run.
We did do a speed run.
Did a co-op speed run offline.
We'll maybe do them online at some point. We've been speedrunning River City Girls co-op, and the game is amazing. The game is really good, and you should absolutely play it.
After Ragnarok, we will do some. We've been busy with that.
Yeah, that is on our to-do list, but not right now. Well, maybe right now when you're listening to this, because that will be after Ragnarok. See, do you understand what I'm saying now that time is fake? It doesn't make any sense.
Well,
and I'm not buying it.
Alexis, do you want to know a fun fact about this episode?
This
episode takes the new record for the longest we've had an episode planned. I believe previous longest was we had scheduled Lena Rain out 2 or 3 months in advance.
I believe we scheduled Lena around the timing of episode 2, and then she was episode 7. So that's pretty far out.
Well, we planned this one in February. I think.
It is now October. And dear listeners, that is quite far out. And speaking of far out, in this episode we will be delving far out, both into the reaches of space and time and also our imagination, in order to discuss science fiction, a genre of writing that may or may not include the use of the phrase far out as a trope. And in order to discuss science fiction, we have someone who does not consume it necessarily as Kaylee and I do, though she probably does, to some amount, but also creates it. So today with us, we have Rosiee Thor, who is the author of the upcoming, I believe it will be released just after this episode is out.
It will have come out a week ago from the time of release. It is upcoming to us, but you can go to your local bookstore and buy it right now.
Yeah, author of the currently upcoming, and by the time you hear this, down going. No, that sounds bad. Let's not do that.
Not that.
Out and available for purchase novel Tarnished Are the Stars. Hello, Rosie.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here. My name is Rosie. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a science fiction author of young adult books for teens.
So yeah, let's talk about science fiction then. How did you get into science fiction just from the get-go?
You know, I don't know that science fiction was really what drew me to fiction in general. And so it's kind of hard to pinpoint when I came to science fiction. I know that I grew up on Doctor Who and, I always really liked Star Wars, but science fiction as a genre was not my gateway into storytelling and, being a writer and also just fiction in general. I was always much more of a fantasy and historical fiction kind of person growing up. So coming to science fiction as a writer was like a weird departure for me in terms of genre. And I kind of just stumbled into it by accident because I was inspired by a couple of weird off-the-wall things that brought me to this book. And I don't even think I knew it was science fiction when I first started writing it. Books are it's so weird categorizing book marketing categories and the way that we talk about genre. And books fit into a lot of different genres sometimes. So my book, Tarnished Are the Stars, the one that's coming out in the past when you're listening to this, but in the future right now, that book falls into multiple genres. So it can be categorized as science fiction. It definitely looks like science fiction from the outside, but it also could fit into fantasy. You could call it steampunk. It has a lot of different genre categories that could be applied to it. And so sci-fi is something that I kind of stumbled into by accident and now really love.
That is not the answer I was expecting, in honesty.
Yeah, it's funny. I have a history of like nerdery and liking anime and liking TV shows and stuff like that you would think would be very based in sci-fi. I'm a huge fan of Star Wars now, and I'm a huge fan of Firefly, and I like Star Trek. But back when I was first, getting my feet wet in terms of fiction and fantasy and science fiction, sci-fi was not where I went originally. Yeah, I really stumbled into it later in life. So, and by later in life, I mean like my early 20s. So not really later, but.
Why don't we talk a little bit more about that and like what sort of steps you went through in this journey to end up in science fiction?
Yeah.
Like where you started in writing and like how you sort of got along that path.
Yeah, with writing, it's always a little bit odd for me to try to pinpoint exactly when I really got into writing, but I do remember growing up, I was always really into fantasy storytelling. My mom would tell me stories when I was going to bed, and I would always interrupt her and start taking over the story because, I wanted to tell the story the way I wanted it to go. And those stories were always about fairies and, magical creatures and stuff like that. So I really think that my roots are definitely in fantasy, which, is a short jump over to sci-fi. And growing up, all those books that I read that I really enjoyed, like Howl's Moving Castle, I really liked Tamora Pierce. I was a huge fan of Harry Potter growing up, and those are all fantasy novels that, you can make the jump over into sci-fi pretty quickly from there.
Yeah, I can definitely see that.
Like we said, this was the farthest out we've ever scheduled an episode, and the reason we did that, as we implied earlier, but perhaps did not explicitly state, was to have this episode coincide with the release of Tarnished Are the Stars. So why don't you tell us about that, about how it came together, and about what our listeners can look forward to if they decide to stray from their home in podcasting and settle into a new, exciting, visual, and completely non-auditory medium of reading.
Well, first I will say that if the listeners don't want to depart from an auditory experience, there is an audiobook version of Tarnished Are the Stars, and it's amazing. And I say that as someone who, obviously it's my book, and I feel really egotistical saying that, but the audiobook narrator is Rosiee Jones, so you get two Rosies in one, and she does a phenomenal job. She's incredible. They sent me I think it was 12 different auditions for the audiobook, and she was the winner by far. It was unanimous among a publishing team, so it was very easy for us to decide that she was the one. And she does a really, really good job, and you can get that over on Audible or Libro FM if you're into supporting your local bookstore instead of Amazon, which, you might be if you're listening to this podcast. Libro FM is a really great alternative. But anyway, the book Tarnished Are the Stars came about back in 2013. I started writing it. I was in college. I kind of remember starting to write it because I really wanted to do a novel writing course, and I was trying to convince my English professor that she should make a 400 level novel writing course for 3 of us that were going to write novels. And I was like, I'm going to totally write a novel, and I will prove it to you by writing the first draft during this term, and then next term you'll let us do a full class and I can write another one. I did not finish it. I don't know if anyone could have seen that plot twist coming, but I wrote about, I think, a quarter of it and then was like, this is hard and I'm not good at it, and just abandoned it completely. I wrote 2 other novels after that. Totally awful. Just completely trashed them. They're never going to see the light of day. But I did come back to this one a couple of years later after college, and I came back to it. I don't really know why I came back to it. It was this idea that was just sitting in my brain. And for some reason, the story kept kind of calling to me like, hey, you didn't finish this. You should probably finish this. If you finish this, you can say that you did, and that will make you proud. And so I did. I went back to it multiple times over the next few years, and I've actually written 11 complete full drafts of this book. And by full drafts, I mean I completely rewrote it from scratch. 100% of the book was rewritten. Barely any of it even remotely survived from draft to draft. And that process actually is what brought me to my queer labels and my identity. And so the process of writing this book allowed me to come out. And I think that's something that, we talk a lot about how representation matters in media, and seeing ourselves portrayed on TV shows or in books is really helpful, especially when we're young and we don't know our identities, and getting to see that on the page or on screen is really impactful. I didn't ever really see my identity growing up, and so I didn't really know what that was going to be like. So I wrote my own, and that was really impactful. I didn't know that it would be, because I didn't know that I had an identity to discover. I kind of always thought I was queer, but I didn't really know where I fell in any of those labels. And in writing the book and in revising those character arcs, I was able to find those labels and figure them out based on the pieces of myself that I put into each of the characters. And I forgot the question that you asked me at the beginning because I just went off on this big old tangent, but...
Well, that was a better answer anyways. That was a better answer anyways, so don't even worry about it. I think what we were talking about was tell us about your book. So now that we've talked about all of that, why don't you give us just kind of the back cover summary sort of deal? Or I guess all of the cool fancy books have the reviews on the back cover. So the little the slip on the dust cover where the actual plot summary is, give us that.
Okay, well, so I'll give you the slightly shorter version because the plot summary is a little bit long. But basically what the book is it's about 3 queer teenagers who are all from different social classes and social strata. One of them is a mechanic. She's from a small hidden village of outcasts. One of them is a nobleman. He's the son of the planet's commissioner who's in charge, big man in charge. And then there's a spy who is the queen's assassin, and she is sort of kind of in the underbelly of the space station and in all of the politics of the space station. And the 3 of them come together to basically solve a mystery about an epidemic of heart disease that's ravaging the planet so they can save their people and actually settle the planet. So those 3 characters are, all very mistrusting of each other. They're all very different, but they're all queer. And that's one of the things that brings them together. It's this idea of community and finding your people and your found family.
That sounds great. Well, I look forward to hopefully getting a chance to read it. I mean, I'm stupid busy, so I will try, as should all of our listeners.
Big mood.
We should, especially with Author Month now, aka the second half of October and the first half of November.
It didn't work out in our recording schedule or publishing schedule, but don't worry about it. It's Author Month.
I'm happy to announce that we are now starting Setting the Record Queer Book Club. So this is your task.
That would actually be pretty great, honestly.
This is your task for this week's book club month. You don't have to read a whole book in a week.
Yeah, so your book club assignment for this 2 weeks is to read and or listen to Tarnished Are the Stars, and I expect a full 4-page literary analysis on my desk by noon on Tuesday, whatever the date of the next episode releases.
I might just open a channel in the Discord when this releases called Book Club, and you can talk about the books.
Yes, please. That'll be great. Let's do it. We're immortalizing this in the recording so that, once again, we don't forget.
I'm not gonna lie, there are a lot of authors out there that, their big dream is like fan art or fan fiction. My dream is absolutely literary analysis. I'm such a nerd.
Well, hey, if someone else there wants to do a full-scale literary analysis of Tarnished Are the Stars, you will earn yourself a hot shout-out on this podcast. I'm sure that's so motivating for the amount of work that we are suggesting you do. I'm not offering you money, though, because...
I mean, look, if you want to be mentioned on this podcast, it's either do this or learn fully.
I mean,
which
or you
is
could just,
easier.
Ask questions for us or for our listeners, or give your answer to Kaylee's question of the week, because we like to feature our favorite one at the end of every episode via Twitter, email, in our community Discord, so on and so forth.
Yeah, we'll say you'll say
the broken
all of that
record
again
continues
at
to
the
skip. Anyways. Yeah, so please do a full literary analysis of Tarnished Are the Stars, every single one of you, and again, I expect them on my desk before the next episode releases. Let us continue. Kaylee, why don't you pick up here?
All right, so I apologize for asking the single most cliched question. So in order to do it, I'm going to do it in the single most cliched ways. So, what's your process?
I'll have you know that is not the most cliche question that we get. And I don't hate that one nearly as much as, now, where do you get your ideas? Because that one's just I don't know. I watched a commercial and there was somebody with red hair and I thought that would be a great book. It's such a silly question that you get so often. No idea. But my process, that's something I can talk about.
Adding to the notes, where do you get your ideas?
I'm watching her type this in Google Docs in real time.
I don't know why I bothered to really type it.
I then watched her delete it in real time, so don't worry, you're safe.
Amazing. I think I've gotten that question in interviews probably 20 times at this point, and I don't have an actual good answer to it, so whatever. But my process I can totally talk about. My process is different for every single book that I've written. Never had a process go the same way twice. So with Tarnished Are the Stars, I was a total pantser, which means that I fly by the seat of my pants when I'm writing, for the first draft, which, as I mentioned, was only about a quarter of a book. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know what my plan was. I had absolutely no idea what I was trying to do with this book, and it showed, and it didn't work. So I went back to it with a big spreadsheet. I love spreadsheets. I'm a complete nerd about organization and doing outlines, and I have beat sheets that I use and everything like that. And so for this book, I outlined it to death. I did every single beat sheet under the sun, and I did a huge spreadsheet with all of the plot points that I wanted to happen and all of the different character arc moments that I needed to happen to coincide with those plot moments. It was a mess. And it worked. It worked okay. I had a workable draft that made sense. It had 3 acts. Did you hear that? My dog just did the shaky thing. Should I go back?
But, yeah, you should probably just repeat that, but
okay.
Good dog.
Yeah. So I had a book with 3 full acts and it made sense. And that was a big plus. The problem with that is that it felt very rigid and I needed to go back and rework some of it so that the characters were interacting in a way that made sense for who they were as people, not just for what needed to happen for the plot. So by around draft 5 or 6, I had a really good, solid plot outline of the story. The book followed a plot that made sense, but it was very plot driven. The characters were really boring. They weren't doing anything that made sense for them. So then I went back and revised it for the characters themselves. So I did 11 drafts total for this book, and it was exhausting, and I'm never doing that again, hopefully, I say, crossing all of my fingers. But then, in subsequent books that I've written or been working on, I've used a much less rigid outlining system. I now outline 1 act at a time, and allow that act to have more, I allow myself more options within it. So I outline what's going to happen between the very beginning and the end of Act 1 and what needs to happen in order to build up the story. But then I let myself play within that so that the characters have room to grow and have room to show who they are before I dive into Act 2. And so what tends to happen is that I have a big plan of like, this is probably what's going to happen at the end. But by the end of Act 1, I can throw out anything that I've planned in Act 2 and Act 3 because they're absolutely not going to happen anymore. The characters have changed. That's not what they would do anymore. So then I outline the first half of Act 2 and write that. And again, anything that I planned after that gets tossed out the window because those characters change and grow. And the way that they are interacting with the world around them and the plot and the other characters completely changes where their arcs are headed and what needs to happen in the story for them to have a significant and satisfying ending. So I kind of take pieces from both of those different methods, the flying by the seat of your pants method and the just completely wild outlining method with spreadsheets and, a cork board that looks like it's real bad. But then if you just take pieces of each, that works really well for me.
Ah, yes, the classic half pants approach or the shorts approach.
We call it plantsing. Because it's halfway between planning and pantsing. So we call it plantsing, but shorting is good too. Shorts.
Blessed. Absolutely blessed. Notes that for later. You've got your whole broader process, but when you're down to the day-to-day of writing, is there anything specific that is sort of important to the way you write? Whether it be a physical writing thing or something, beyond that, something of the meta writing. I'm just going to use that word because it sounds appropriate for science fiction. Are there any, writing or literally grammar techniques that are important to the way you write? Anything of that nature on sort of the smaller scale than the overall writing and drafting and revising process?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. I will say that I'm one of the people who likes to listen to music when I write. So I tend to make a playlist for the book before I write it, and this is a really amazing procrastination technique. So I don't actually have to write the book. It's great, big fan. So that playlist always has to have music that's thematically in line with the book. So if I have a romance arc that's a breakup book, which is what I'm working on right now, actually, most of the songs are sad breakup songs or songs about lighting your ex-boyfriend's car on fire, and it's great. But it's also a sort of jazzy world building sort of book, and so all of the music is swung music or blues. So a lot of it is postmodern jukebox kind of stuff. So it has to also have the vibe of the book. So that's really important for me, and that music basically is a Pavlovian trick. It tricks my brain into thinking it's time to write. So when I hear that song or when I hear any song on that playlist, my brain is it's time to write, you have to work. Which is really terrible if I pick a song that's really popular because I hear it on the radio and I'll be driving and I'll get that, ooh, I'll just tense up immediately. I'll be driving down the freeway and a song will come on and it's just a total nightmare. So that's not great. So I tend to pick music that's covers of popular songs. So it's not exactly the same. The other thing that I do that is very weird and not super conducive to my current life schedule is that I write at weird hours. I could have a whole day free and I would get more done between the hours of 8 p.m. and midnight than I would get done all day. So even if I'm sitting in front of the computer all day, which I have done before when I'm on deadline, I will get maybe 1,000 words done between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. And then I'll get 3,000 words done between, 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. And it's just, I write so much faster in the evening when I'm supposed to be going to sleep, probably because I'm supposed to be going to sleep, which is not great because I work at 7 a.m. every day. So that's also part of that process. And then as far as the nitty gritty goes of the actual writing, I don't have anything super specific grammar-wise or to the actual wordsmithing, but I do write in Scrivener, which is an app that allows you to move chapters around really easily, which is great. It's not quite as one structure as Microsoft Word. It just has a lot more flexibility in it, and you can change the colors, which is fun.
So what's unique about writing sci-fi as opposed to other genres of writing, for lack of a better word, because I don't think there really is one? For other genres of words on paper, or not necessarily on paper, but in sequence to be read as a whole and understood that way as well. And I guess we can also extend this to, I believe you said you do YA sci-fi. So what's unique about writing in that sort of sphere as opposed to in other genres?
Yeah, I would say that sci-fi is unique in that it's both familiar and strange. It has elements of both. You're always going to have something that has to be plausible within sci-fi because it is science fiction. It's usually either, close science fiction where it's a couple of years in the future, or it might be science fiction where it's, very far out in the future, but it's still going to have elements of reality to it. You have to have a plausible backdrop for the story. You have to be able to at least pretend like the weird things in your world are possible. If there are aliens, they have to have some form of anatomy that makes any kind of sense. If you're going to have time travel, it has to be logical. If you're going to have, a new element or something like that, that has to fit within the existing structure. So when you're doing science fiction, you do have to be able to fit things into a reality that makes sense. Things like The Hunger Games, that's science fiction, but it's set in a fake United States that's divided up into different districts. And it's still set in a world that's similar to ours. It's just tweaked a little bit. Same thing goes for, any kind of sci-fi that you have. Even if it's set in space, it still has to be a plausible future for our current reality. With fantasy, the difference there is that it doesn't have to be nearly as plausible. You can have magic that doesn't have to make any kind of scientific sense. You can have weird governmental structures that just, are bizarre, or, different country relations that don't make sense within our world structure. But even in those genres, you do have to have a sense of reality to it. Those genres still have to be plausible to readers. I think the difference with science fiction is that it has to be not only plausible, but it has to fit into a logical sensibility.
And then to sort of take that idea one step further, what's unique about writing queer sci-fi? Because, to me, sci-fi has all of these themes of, transhumanism and everything that, cyberpunk is, and, anti-corporations and anti-norms and all this sort of stuff, which is all super inherently queer. And if you disagree with me on that, you can all fight me, but you'd be wrong.
I don't think anyone listening to this podcast will fight you.
No, that's why I said that, because I'm a coward and do not want to fight. But yeah, I think there's a lot of queerness inherent to sci-fi, even just from my perspective. So what's it like writing queer sci-fi?
With queer sci-fi, there's so many different ways that you can go with the future. You can go into a future that's very bleak. You can go into a future that is optimistic. There's so many ways to shape science fiction world building. And I think that there's been, for a very long time, there has been this idea that the world building of science fiction and fantasy has to mimic our own. We can't have a world where something that is inherent to our cultural structures in today is flipped on its head. We see fantasy out there that has patriarchal systems and feminism is barely a movement. And it's so bizarre because we are free to imagine anything we want. And with writing queer science fiction, we can create a world where queerness is valid, where it is accepted, where it is celebrated, something that you can do within that world building. And it's these choices that you get to make as a writer, what you want to do with that. The choices that I made in Tarnished Are the Stars are completely different from the choices that I will make in other books. And there's so many different ways to build queerness into the world building. And so that's something that I think a lot of allo cishet writers may not think about. And I think a lot of queer writers probably spend a lot more time thinking about how queerness interacts with the world building that they're creating in the story. And that creates, I think, a whole other layer of depth to the story.
So you've written your book. What's it like going from having written your book to getting your book published and the steps involved with that?
Yeah, well, a lot of writers will tell you that publishing is a complete trash fire. It's a danger zone. It is a terrible, terrible place. Awful things happen there. That's not completely true. Publishing is really rough. And that's, I think, what most of us are getting at, is that publishing is a difficult industry to get into, and it's a difficult industry to survive in. Getting published is 1 in a million. It is such a long, grueling process, and to actually get a book published is a huge deal. And I try to say that with as much humility as possible, but it is. To get published, basically, you need to have a completed book, and then you need to have a pitch for that book. So it needs to be basically what we talked about before, the back of the book, the back cover copy, that sort of thing. You're going to send that out to agents. And those agents are industry professionals who know what they're looking for. They know what editors want. They know the trends within the genre. And they're also really good at selling books. And then they're going to negotiate your contract with the publisher as well. And it's really key to have an agent, especially if you're going to be looking at large publishers, because those contracts can be really grabby. They can be very difficult to understand. There's a lot of stuff that goes into those contracts that isn't necessary or is kind of a little bit weird and off the wall. And if you don't know what you're looking at, then you might get stuck into a contract that's actually going to end up hindering your career. So those agents are there to help you. And an agent is going to read your manuscript and your pitch, and they're going to decide if they want to represent you. So getting an agent is already a huge deal. There's a lot of writers out there who don't ever get agents. So getting an agent, that's a big thing. If you have an agent, if you get an agent, you should celebrate big time. And then the next step after that is going to be to submit the book to publishers. So after your agent has had a look at the book, they want to represent it, maybe they go through some editorial work with you, then it gets sent out to publishers. It's going to get sent to editors who your agent has a relationship with or knows are looking for books kind of like yours. And then those editors are going to read it. And if you're very, very lucky, an editor will like it and they'll want to buy it. But whether they can or not is not necessarily up to them. So if they do like it and they want to buy it, they're going to take it to second reads, which is where they talk to other editors at their publishing house, at their imprint, and those editors read the book. And they either say, yeah, you're right, this is great, or they go, what were you thinking? This book is completely unsellable and unmarketable. You're wrong, and you need to go lay down and have a nap to think about what you've done. And so if those editors like it and they agree with the editor who wants to buy your book, that's good news, because then it means that your book could go to acquisitions. Acquisitions is where the marketing team and the publicity team and sales team and accounting, all of the people, and also a dragon and a unicorn meet together in publishing on a day when they're all available, which never happens. So it's a very slow process. And they all discuss the book and whether or not they want to buy it. So they don't necessarily all read it, but they might read the pitch and maybe a couple of chapters. And then the editor who wants to buy the book will present it to them and be like, hey, so this book is great and you should buy it. And they may or may not decide to do that. If they decide yay, then the editor will send an offer letter to your agent, and then your agent will hopefully call you with the good news, and you'll be sick like I was, and you'll get the call, and it'll totally make your day. If they don't buy it, that's a big bummer, and then they'll let your agent know, and they'll be sad about it, but oh well, and you'll carry on. So that process can take anywhere from just a couple of months to several years. I know people who've been on submission with their agent. Their agents put them out to editors, and they have been on submission for over a year before their book sells. And that's actually pretty common. For me, I was on submission for about 6 months, which is pretty fast considering the industry. I do know people who've sold way, way faster, and those are outliers. They rarely happen that quickly, but it does happen sometimes. So the process is pretty slow. And then, of course, you have an editor and you have a publisher, and they bought your book for some money. Probably, hopefully, you get some money. And then after that, you would do editorial work with the editor until the book is ready to be released.
And I see, I will never even be in a position where I'm trying to get a book published. And yet, I was very stressed out just hearing you talk about that.
Yeah, doesn't sound great.
We say that publishing is, it's not for the weak of heart. It's really for, if you have a thick skin, if you're resilient and you can take a lot of rejection, then it's something that you can get through. But it is really rough in terms of, how much rejection you're going to face. The amount of people who are going to say no is much, much higher than the amount of people that are going to say yes. But it does only take one yes. You only need one editor to say yes. I only had one agent offer, and I only had one editorial offer. And so you don't need to have, 10 different agents fighting over your book or 10 different publishing houses going to auction over your book in order to sell it. I know people who have had, 4 or 5 agents all wanting to sign them, and then their book goes on to not sell at all. And I've had friends who have had one agent offer go on to sell at auction between 5 or 6 different houses. So it's, there's no way to predict these things. And sometimes you can be really successful having not been successful for a very long time. And sometimes you have a really quick success, and then it's just your book dies on submission.
This legitimately makes me just want to go lie down.
That's been my last 2 years. I've just been like, can I lie down now?
Just from hearing you talk about it, I just feel like I need a nap. And a trash can near the bed.
Given that the book is near release, it sounds like you survived that, so...
I did. I did survive that, and I would say that the reason I survived it, because I went through something just way, way more stressful right before finishing the novel. And so I was part of a pitch contest. I did this online pitch contest called Pitch Wars. Basically what that is it's a huge crash course in revision and publishing. You submit your book to mentors. So this is before agents, mentors, and they will work with you on your book to revise it for a showcase where then agents will request it. So I got chosen for that. It's a huge program. It happens every year. I really recommend it. Pitch Wars or Author Mentor Match also does the same thing. They're both really, really good programs. And so I did Pitch Wars, and my mentor helped me revise my book. And I revised it, and then she read it again and said, you revised it wrong and you have to do it over again. And I had about 2 weeks before the mentor showcase at that point. So I had 2 weeks to revise my book again. And like I said, all of these revisions I was doing were complete rewrites. I was rewriting it from the ground up because the things that were broken in it were big structural things. They were pieces that if I removed them or if I moved them around, it was going to shake up everything else in the book. So I had about 2 weeks to revise an 85,000 word novel. That's about 300 pages or so for context. And I had 2 weeks to rewrite it. And I did that. I don't think I slept very much. My roommates had to feed me and remind me to shower. It was awful. But I did it, and I completed that, and that was the most stressful thing I've ever had to do publishing related. So everything else that came after that was like a walk in the park.
Yeah, that doesn't sound fun. I feel weird even putting the word fun in a sentence about that at all. Even when I'm contrasting it with fun, it still feels disingenuous. I think the best word I could give on that one is just oof.
Oof is right. I would say, I'm not trying to discourage anyone who wants to be an author or who plans to do this, but I do want to say, the industry is not for everyone. It can absolutely kill the fun of writing. I'm really lucky in that I enjoy that kind of stress. I thrive under pressure like that. So when I get a really tight deadline, it's like, okay, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do it faster than they want me to. And I get really into the competitive spirit of it. And it's how I work best. But it can be really grueling, and sometimes it's easy to lose sight of the end product. You feel like, oh my gosh, I've been working for 6 months on this thing and it's still not good enough and it's never going to be good enough and it's not what I wanted it to be and I should just throw it all in the garbage. But the thing is that eventually you will get there and eventually it will be what you wanted it to be. And I know that now from experience, having done it before. It's really rewarding once you get to the end, but that process can be just, well, as you said, oof.
This is episode 29, and I don't think I've ever been more stressed out listening to a guest talk about something.
I feel so bad. I think it's because I'm like right in the last week leading up to my book that I'm just like, everything has been so hard. And that next week, if you were to ask me these same questions, I'd be like, so writing is amazing. It's full of butterflies and there are fairies coming out of my brain. It'd just be completely different.
All right. Well, now that you've released your book, because of course, by the time anyone hears this, you'll have released the book, except for our editor who sort of lives in the future. Just as we kind of do. Now that your book has been released in the past, of course, what, if anything, are you working on now?
Well, I can't talk a whole lot about what I'm working on next, but I will say that I have a lot of things in the works, and they are all very, very queer, and I am very excited to share them soon. I think if there's anything else I can really share about them, and I think I'm not really allowed to.
That's valid. I guess people will just have to keep an eye on you to hear the answer when they can hear it. So, I guess kind of what sort of like greater communities do you take part in this whole process from writing to publishing?
There is a thriving writing community on Twitter. I would say that Twitter is really where publishing and writing is happening in terms of online spaces. There are definitely Reddit communities where there are writers who are talking about writing or swapping chapters, things like that. I'm not really over there. I think Tumblr probably has a pretty good writing community, but publishing itself is really on Twitter. And there are certain hashtags that people are on. Hashtag am writing or hashtag am revising is somewhere some people hang out. There are writing contests, and that's a really big way to make friends in the writing community. That's how I made most of my friends, are, places like Pitch Wars, where I did this mentorship contest and met a lot of writers who are now also having their first books come out now. And so that community is really thriving on Twitter. I think the best way to engage in it is to find contests or critique partner matchups. And that way you can engage with other writers who are at the same stage as you and stuff like that. For me, the online writing community has been huge, especially on Twitter. It's where I found out about my queer identities, actually. And so in writing Tarnished Are the Stars, before I knew about, my IDs, I had never seen words like aromantic or asexual before. They were completely new to me. And so when I was on Twitter hanging out, people were talking about something called the Own Voices movement, which is people who are writing their own experiences. It's basically to encourage you to read more books by people of color, about people of color, or about queer people by queer people, or about people with disabilities, about characters with disabilities. And so these different types of stories that are being written by people who share those experiences. And in finding out about Own Voices, I was able to then find out more about different queer identities and finding out about these different kind of subcategories where you can be on a spectrum. And that was so impactful for me because I had no idea about any of these spectrums. I didn't know that queerness was not just, one thing. I thought it was you have to be either straight or gay or bisexual. And there's all these other ways to be queer. And so finding those labels was huge for me. It also enabled me to then revise my book to match my labels better and to then learn more about my labels through my characters. So for me, the online writing community has just changed the course of my writing trajectory completely. And so I really encourage anyone who wants to be an author or who just enjoys writing to engage with the writing and author community on Twitter. It's a really cool place, and there's a lot of really important conversations happening there.
Well, if someone's looking to get started in writing and in the writing community, what places and resources and people can they look forward? If you were to go back in time and give yourself the advice that you would have most benefited from hearing to start writing, what would that advice be?
I mean, the most important thing that I wish I could go back and tell myself is that perfection is a lie. And reworking the same chapter over and over again isn't going to get you any closer to the end. There's this idea of I have to get it right before I can move on that I had when I was a younger writer that I've since completely thrown out the window. I have to get it right enough that I can keep moving forward in a trajectory that makes sense, but it doesn't have to be perfect. And trying to make it perfect will end up stalling you in the same place forever. So really, I would really encourage anyone who wants to be an author, who wants to be a writer, to do the thing that the title says that you do and write. Write as much as you can, write whenever you can. Brainstorm ideas with another person if you can. It's really fun to be able to riff on an idea with someone else. And that brings me to the other piece of advice, which is get critique partners. Once you have something written, and even if you don't have a full book, even if it's just a couple of chapters, having someone else in it with you will not only encourage you to finish it, but also it will make you a better writer. The critique process, I think, is what really jump-started my growth as a writer. I finished my book and then went out and tried to get some critique partners. And I found this critique partner who is wonderful. And actually, we're not critique partners anymore, but her book actually just came out earlier this year. Her name is Anna Bright. Her book is The Beholder. We met in 2016, and we were both writing books that were in various stages of completion. And we swapped a bunch of chapters. And that process of critiquing her work and having her critique mine was a huge learning experience for me, because when you get someone else's perspective on your work, you're forced to evaluate it from a different point of view. You're forced to really think about it in terms of how is the reader going to come to this? And even though this isn't what I intended, what are they getting out of it? And then the same is true the opposite way. Critiquing someone else's work teaches you so much about what you value as a reader and as a writer, because you're looking at, okay, well, that doesn't make sense. Or, well, I really didn't like the verb usage here. It really teaches you what you like and what you enjoy in reading, which then you can apply to your own writing. And That's a really difficult thing to do without breaking it down like that. As a writer, you look at your work and you go, well, this is as good as I can make it. And then you go to someone else's work that could be, exponentially better, and you go, well, there's 10 things wrong with it. And if you can then turn that on your own work, it becomes a really valuable experience. So get critique partners, find people who will read your work and who will let you read their work for critique purposes, because that process itself will teach you way more about writing than any sort of course that you can take. The other things that I'm going to recommend are, I think I've already mentioned, but Pitch Wars and Author Mentor Match are two programs that will match you up with an author who will mentor you through the process of revising your novel. They're both contest-based, so not everyone gets a mentor, but they're really, really valuable. I did Pitch Wars back in the day, and now I mentor through Author Mentor Match. They're amazing programs. If you can look into them, that's a great way to find critique partners as well, even if you don't get chosen. But things like that are a really great way to meet other people in the community, get involved, find a critique partner, things like that.
Yeah, it's good advice. Or it's not,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have the experience to say that, but it sounds like good advice.
I mean, Kaylee, you are the one in this call who literally wrote a light novel,
Yeah,
so...
but it wasn't anything serious.
Oh, I completely forgot to plug my own thing. But there's a website, beyourownmentor.com. Actually, I think it's byomentor.com. And it is a blog that I put together with a critique partner of mine, Rachel Griffin. She and I worked on this blog in conjunction with other authors and their revision strategies. So we wrote basically a whole year's worth of blog posts on different revision strategies for different things in books. So things like character development, how to write yourself an edit letter, how to world build in a contemporary setting, things like that. And they're deep dives into these different topics for revision purposes. So if you have a finished novel and you don't know what to do with it, that's basically a whole year's worth of guide posts to help you along the way to revise your novel. And that's a really great resource as well.
All right, well, with all that in mind, whoever is looking to jumpstart their writing career, and particularly possibly whoever even number of listeners who are looking to do that and can pair off to critique each other's work, that would be great. Everyone else who hasn't run off to their typewriters to get to work, who is still listening, now we're going to move into our performance showcase.
Alexis, don't be ridiculous. This is a podcast. They could bring their herald with them to their typewriter.
All right, so for this performance showcase, because, this is a written medium, one of the easier things, I think, to performance showcaseify, some things that we have on this podcast are harder and or more abstract to do than others. This one's real easy, though. We are going to be reading an excerpt from Tarnished Are the Stars. So, Rosie, why don't you sort of set up what we're about to read through? Whatever people would need to know to get the most out of this.
Yeah, for sure. So this is an excerpt from chapter 3. So it's early in the book. You don't need a whole lot of setup. Basically, a couple things you might want to know is that there is a planet down below called Earth Adjacent, and there is a space station, and we're currently on the space station. We're reading from the point of view of Eliza, who is the spy character I mentioned before. And they're at a party for the queen after the nobles have gone down to the planet to experience the planetary market, and they've all come back, and Eliza didn't get to go.
All right, now time to put on my audiobook voice. Earth adjacent, nestled below them, a pop of color in a starry sky. The planet took up nearly a third of the window's area, its oceans staring back as though observing them in equal judgment. It was the dream of all orbitals and their forebears. Find a new planet, terraform it, and begin anew. Someday, it would be their home. They would all get what they wanted. Except Eliza. Eliza didn't care about planets and terraforming. She cared about secrets and scandal. She didn't want a new home on Earth Adjacent. She wanted to find her target and enact the Queen's judgment upon them. She wanted to complete her mission. It is a disappointment, to be sure, Eliza continued, nodding towards the planet. Seeing it from here, I thought it would be more... She paused for effect, dragging her eyes to meet his in a practiced stare before laying down her challenge. Impressive. The word had its desired effect. Lord Farley's jaw tightened and his cheeks flushed almost as though she'd insulted him rather than the planet. He needed only an ounce more goading by Eliza's measurements. The temptation to impress her, lady or no, would be too much. But if you say so, my lord, perhaps visiting Earth adjacent is not so high an honor after all. She would not allow him to mistake her remarks for anything but taunts. It isn't all so bad, my lady, Lord Farley rushed to say. My lady. Truly, if Lord Farley had forgotten to demean her, she had him in her reach. She needed only to decide if he was worth her claws. Isn't it? Come, let us take a turn, and I will show you the only worthwhile thing the earthly planet has to offer. Eliza let him lead her from their perch by the refreshments, though did it count as leading if it was she who'd guided him to the decision? What, pray tell, do you intend to show me, my lord? She asked as they made their way from one end of the monstrous window to the other. First, you must promise to keep this our secret. A secret? I love secrets. Though she said the words in a breathy, high voice enriched with false excitement, they were the truest words she'd spoken all day. With any luck, this will be the first of many secrets we may share. Lord Farley paused, steering her into the shadows of the sloping hallway beyond, resting his hand far too comfortably at her waist. She would make him regret it all too soon, but first she needed to confirm he was, in fact, her intended target. You have me quite intrigued, I must say. I sincerely hope it's worth all the fuss. Lord Farley chuckled. It's only a little something I brought back from my voyage. Eliza's face fell. A trinket? Please, sir, if all you have to show me is a bauble from the market, tell me now. Any one of our friends in the gallery could fulfill that curiosity. She took a small step back. A simple trick, but effective nonetheless, as his expression grew desperate. But you, Lord Farley, are not so ordinary, are you? Now she leaned forward, one hand toying with her ringlets. Another trick, this time a diversion, while she slipped her other hand into the deep pocket of her skirt. You led me to believe it was something more thrilling. He grinned. You're a sharp one, Miss Eliza. You have no idea. Let us say, my little souvenir would not be to the Queen's liking. Out of the other courtier's lines of sight, from his breast pocket he withdrew her prize, and Lord Farley outgrew his use to her. Quite the transgression, my lord. Nothing of the innocent tone remained in her voice, her tone acidic and dry. The Queen will be interested to know what you've been up to. She shoved him square in the chest, pushing him back around the bend of the hallway, far from sight. Lord Farley stumbled and hit the wall, an ill-formed mask of rage covering his panic. What was it you planned? To get me alone and use your wiles to get me to talk? Eliza advanced, and Lord Farley retreated. Not my wiles, no. She had him pinned now. Then I'm afraid you've miscalculated. I'm twice your size and twice your better. You'll earn no favors with the Queen by angering me. But if we were to join forces, I could promise you protection, and perhaps even elevation. I don't need protection. Sometimes a good weapon didn't draw blood. And sometimes a good weapon was a sharp hers blade. From her pocket, fingers wrapped around the hilt of the short dagger. The blade was etched with a light dusting of stars, and the pommel boasted a singular silver eye. Of course, Lord Farley sighed, closing his eyes in resignation. I should have known you would be the eyes of the Queen. And ears. I have many uses. You can't kill me. I'm a lord. The Queen would never stand for it. I am of noble class. Eliza swung, crashing the pommel into the side of his head, and he crumpled to the floor. Today, the best weapon was the one that could draw blood, but didn't. All right, well, the first thing I'd like to point out about that is truly are living in a great science fiction universe when the skirt has deep pockets.
It was very important to me that everyone in the future have pockets. Having lived in girl jeans my entire life, that's probably the worst part about this timeline, in terms of fashion anyway. So, deep pockets in everything. Everybody has pockets.
Anyways,
all the
let's
time.
talk about like the actual writing.
I chose this chapter mostly because Eliza was my favorite to write, but also because there's a little bit of interesting history behind this chapter. And anyone who decides to read the book can kind of gauge this for themselves. But when this book sold to my editor, Eliza was not a POV character. Her chapters did not exist in the book. It was just the two other characters. And so her chapters didn't exist. And his main edit when we had our first editorial phone call was, what he really wanted me to do was add an Eliza chapter. That was the main edit that he mentioned. He said, she's amazing. She's super savvy. Why isn't she a character? We don't get inside her head. And, that makes her less interesting. And he's totally right. Eliza's just way more interesting character having written her POV. She used to be a little bit more flat. And so getting to write from her perspective and really see into her motivations and who she is, that was so much fun. I had such a good time doing it. And what it allowed me to do was create a brand new voice for her chapters. Obviously, it's written in third person, and so we're not getting a distinct voice from each character in terms of who they are and how they would say things in the narration. But I did do a couple of things to differentiate the chapters and the voices between the characters, because even though it's third person and it is being written by a narrator of sorts, I wanted the narration to reflect the vibe of the characters. And so with each character, I got to tweak how I was writing. And so in Eliza's chapters, there's different vocabulary that I use. I use metaphors specifically about stars and knives. There's a lot of blade metaphors in her chapters because she's kind of stabby. I call her the stabby sapphic. And so she has a lot of metaphors involving, death and weaponry and fashion. With the other two characters, Anna the mechanic has a lot of metaphors involving, nuts and bolts and cogs, metal, things like that, surgery, so veins and different kinds of medical techniques. And then Nathaniel, he is the nobleman. He's very soft at heart, and so he has a lot of metaphors that are about family and growth. He uses a lot of metaphors about nature, trees, things like that. So I got to differentiate each of them with these specific vocabulary terms and metaphors that they would use. So even though the narration style is still fairly similar between the three of them, there are certain words or turns of phrase that only certain characters use, or even in the narration only uses in their chapters. So this Eliza chapter was the first chapter that I wrote after getting that edit from my editor, and it came to me so quickly, and it was so natural to write that it felt like an obvious choice to pick for reading aloud, because it's just such a fun it was such a fun experience for me to write it. And when you're a writer, a lot of your work ends up being very tired by the end. You're exhausted by it. Even if other people, it's brand new to them and they've never read it before and it's totally delightful. To me, it's like, I've read this 8,000 times. We cannot read the first chapter. So picking something a little bit later in and something that I really enjoyed writing was an obvious choice for me.
I don't really have a lot to say because, book good.
Book good.
Book,
that's what you want to hear.
Yeah, book good. I think book sound good in earhole.
Book do sound good in earhole.
I bet book would also be good reflect into sight balls.
Book feel good come out of mouth hole, as well as I was the one who read the thing.
Wow, I really hope that all makes it in.
Oh, that's making it in.
No.
Don't worry.
Our editor is not allowed to take out those things. We said them, and now we have to live with the consequences.
I mean, technically, our editor gets final say on everything. So, if you edit this out, though, you're fired. And then you're hired back because we need you.
Yeah. I don't know. I liked the stabby sapphic. I always enjoy coy assassin girl plays with boring nobleman who thinks he has the upper hand. That's a good trope right there. And I'm a big fan.
I will give you a little bit of a behind the scenes about this particular scene, and that the version that I wrote originally, so when I wrote it the first time and sent it to my editor, I was told that it was a little bit too sexy. Hilarious, because she is maximum lesbian and he is boring bloke, and she's not interested in him at all. But there were some apparently knife metaphors that were a little bit too on the nose, and so I was told it was just a little bit too salacious and I needed to dial it back a little bit. And in the end, I think it ended up being a better scene, but I do remember getting that note and just being like, what? How did I do that? I'm an ace person. I don't know how to do that. So it was this very funny experience, and this has happened multiple times when my editor is like, you made this scene a little bit too, it's just a little too sexy. And here I am but how?
Well, with all of that talk of the book and also a bunch of weird topics that I don't know how we got into, it's time for listener questions. And if you ever have questions for us or for our guests, you can ask them in our Discord at bit.ly/strqcord, on Twitter at strqueercast, or by email at settingtherecordqueer@gmail.com. We only have one question this week that hasn't already been covered, but this one is from Julie via email. What's your favorite sci-fi novel?
Ooh,
Probably qualify that with, like, that you didn't write, maybe?
There's this really good one anyway. There's this really good one called Tarnished Are the Stars. Have you ever heard of it?
Big fan. No, writers are notoriously self-deprecating, so that would never happen. I would never pick my own book. But, let's see. Favorite sci-fi novel. Let me just plug a couple so that because I will never ever be able to think of an actual favorite. But a couple that I've really enjoyed recently with different flavors of sci-fi. I really enjoyed Wilder Girls, which I think everyone on this podcast should enjoy because it's also queer. It is a sapphic horror sci-fi, and it's about 3 girls who are part of a sort of boarding school summer program, and they all get stuck on this island because of a plague that hits the island is causing all of these mutations. And it's very body horror, Lord of the Flies, but feminist kind of a thing. And it was just excellent. It's literary and pitch perfect. It was incredible. It's by Rory Powell. Highly, highly recommend it if you like any sort of kind of spooky atmospheric things. It's a really good horror novel that doesn't have like jump scares. So it's more of a moody horror rather than a like screamer kind of horror. Is that a word, screamer?
I guess.
We're gonna go.
I was just kind of wondering how you would do jump scares in a book. I mean, unless it's literally a pop-up book, like...
That would be brilliant. Someone should do that. Oh my gosh, that's brilliant.
I feel like it'd be cool, but I also feel like it would be hard to take, like... No, I'm actually not.
That would be such a funny, like, spooky Halloween picture book.
Yeah, I mean, if it's not like, actually scary, definitely. Yeah. I mean, I've seen some really good smart pop-up book art, like, unironically, like, not like children's pop-up book, like adult, sort of. Not like adult, but like, you know, meant to be like, this is impressive to an adult. And I feel like it could be done. Anyways, let's get back to your novel choices. And if one of those people who has picked up a writing buddy listening to this episode decide they want to write the pop-up jump scare horror novel, once you're done writing and publishing that, please come on the podcast and tell us all about that. For now, though, please get to work while Rosiee tells us about more books.
Yeah, so a couple others that I've really enjoyed recently, or even not so recently. One that I would say was a huge inspiration for me writing, and this was, oh gosh, this one's not recent at all. This one's several years ago. It's Cinder by Marissa Meyer, and it is about a cyborg main character. It's a Cinderella retelling, and the main character is a cyborg who is a mechanic, and it's set in this it's set in the real world, but there's all these fantasy elements to it. There's an evil queen from the moon, an alien. She's, you know, kind of creepy and a little bit has something off about her, and she's really amazing. And then there's sequels that retell Little Red Riding Hood or Rapunzel, and they're all set in this sci-fi world it's in the future with the moon as a basically sovereign nation that's kind of in conflict with Earth. And so that series is really incredible. It's fairy tale retellings in a sci-fi world with, I would say, a really strong fantasy vibe. So I really enjoyed those, and I would say that if you enjoy my book or if you enjoy that book, you should read the other thing. So those are definitely in the same sort of vein. And then the other one that I would recommend is Brightly Burning by Alexa Dunn. And that is a Jane Eyre retelling set in space. So it has all of the sort of politics of Jane Eyre, of Charlotte Bronte's work, kind of that internal character politics of these relationships and how that goes, but it's set in space in a sort of dystopic future.
Cool. Well, all of those sound very good.
I'm actually glad you brought that last one up because it transitions us very well in Haley's question of the week. Before we get to that, if you're listening to this podcast for the first time and you don't know what Kaylee's question of the week is, it's basically a pretty standard question. You know, the sort of thing that, like, you'll find printed on the back of a book that you haven't read in thousands of years, but you know you had read it thousands of years ago somehow, and the rest of the book has faded to dust by this point, but just clearly on the back cover, as if printed on today, a question is just formed perfectly, and it reads, if you were to adapt any non-science fiction work, either fiction or non-fiction, into sci-fi, what would you pick and why?
I just want to say that that question introduction was a lot, and I'm both impressed and a little bit disquieted.
Oh, it's just what happens to me Tuesdays.
It's not nearly as much as that one about the person with squirrels for hands.
I forgot
that was a lot.
Oh, I had forgotten about that. Yeah, that's true.
I forgot about that one.
I guess I'll go first, because I kind of know what it is. So when I first read this question, because I always get them a little bit in advance, like whenever Kaylee writes them down, I was like, oh, I have my work cut out for me on this one. The thing that I want already exists. And then I looked it up and found out that it's actually modern, not sci-fi. So basically what I would like is I believe it was Romeo plus Juliet. It's basically Romeo and Juliet, but they all have guns. And so I would like to take that one step further and set it in space.
That sounds incredible.
Exactly.
I would watch that anime or read that book.
Yeah.
I'm just assuming it would be an anime. It feels like it would make a really good anime.
I would take Star Wars, which is technically not science fiction, but future fantasy, and then adapt it into future fantasy, making a slightly different movie, just to make people upset.
That fandom sure is easily upset, so I suspect you would succeed.
It would be the same movie, but there'd be like 20-minute scenes where we go over how each piece of technology works.
So it'd be like a how-to guide for all of the tech.
Yeah, it's science fiction. You got to explain how it works. This isn't future fantasy anymore.
There you go. That works. I already know my answer to this, and it's because it's something that I have wanted to do for a very, very long time and just have to convince someone to let me do it. Actually, gosh, I have two good answers.
Give them both.
I'll give you both of them.
Yeah, give them both.
I have always wanted to adapt Jane Austen's Emma into a science fiction novel where all of the men are spaceships. And I have always wanted to adapt Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing into sci-fi.
One time, I went to London once, and I got to see a play of David Tennant in Much Ado About Nothing. So I think that's basically already been done.
Yeah, I mean, that'll do it. Much Ado About Nothing is the one Shakespeare play that makes me a fan of Shakespeare. You know, I'm not really that into a lot of Shakespeare's plays, but Much Ado About Nothing really, really hits the spot for me. And I actually just adore the movie version with Emma Thompson and Kenneth Branagh that was made way, way back in the day. It's just it's pitch perfect. It really cannot be done better than that. My one qualm about adapting it into sci-fi.
Give us your answer to Kaylee's question of the week. We like to feature our favorite one at the end of every episode of the podcast.
Before we move into our outro, we have a bit of a special thing here. Rosiee has generously given us a copy of her book, either physical, hardcover, softcover, or a download link that we have to give away. So what we're going to do for that is when this episode releases, we're going to make a tweet, and in order to be entered, retweet the tweet, follow the Setting the Record Queer Twitter account, follow Rosie's Twitter account, and respond to the tweet with the name of a character from a science fiction. It doesn't matter if someone else has already said that character, but you need to pick a character from a work of science fiction, and do not tell us what that character is from. In other words, I won't know if you're lying.
If you listen to this, like, between midnight when it gets released and noon when we usually tweet about it, keep your eyes peeled for that tweet. Otherwise, go look for that tweet and name a science fiction character who, again, doesn't necessarily have to actually be a science fiction character because we're not going to check. And just do what the tweet says, and you could get a copy of Tarnished Are the Stars, which you could enjoy. Because you've already heard a segment from the book, and, like, you enjoyed it, so you know you want to read the rest. Just saying. But with that, I think that's an episode right there. So, Rosiee, where can our listeners find you and your book and your other books and that sort of stuff?
Yeah. So you can find me on Twitter. That's where I usually hang out. I'm at Rosiee Thor. It's spelled Rosiee. That's 2 E's. Thor, spelled like the hero. Thor. And that's where I hang out mostly, is on Twitter. You can also find me on Instagram under the same handle, or on my website, rosieethor.com. You can, at the time of this episode, purchase my book, Tarnished Are the Stars, in any bookstore. Independent bookstores are great and super duper support them. Barnes & Noble will have it. You can also get it online if you would like a signed copy. You can order it through Powell's Books. I'll also be doing some events in the Pacific Northwest as well. So if you're in the area and you want to check those out, they are on my website, my Twitter. I'll also be at Y'all Fest in South Carolina. And what day does this thing air?
It will air, it's a week from Tuesday, 22nd. So exactly 1 week after the book comes out.
The thing will be over. So never mind, that's fine. So Y'all Fest in South Carolina, and also I'll be doing some events in the Pacific Northwest.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/settingtherecordqueer. Our patrons can get early guest reveals, access to a special Discord channel, high quality or early episode releases, and special thanks on the podcast. We'd like to offer those special thanks to our $25 and above patrons, Jane, who you can find on Twitter as at callmecadejo. That's at callmecadejo. And American Choir Boy, who you can find on Twitch as American Choir Boy. Otherwise, if you like this podcast, subscribe or leave a review wherever you get your podcasts from. Tell a friend about us or recommend us on social media. You can find us on Twitter at strqueercast, or get in contact with us via email at settingtherecordqueer@gmail.com, or come hang out in our Setting the Record Queer community Discord at bit.ly/strqcord, all lowercase. And in that Discord, you can find us hosts, a bunch of other Setting the Record Queer listeners, and even some of our guests and technical production people who have decided to grace us with their presence. While you're there, ask questions for us or our guests, or give us feedback. Maybe you have a cool idea for who or what should be on this podcast, or think you should be on this podcast. Please let us know. We're always looking for ideas, especially if you're a Foley artist. Our logo for this podcast was designed by Cubotic. That's at QBTIC on Twitter, or Cobot, QOBOT.tumblr.com. The theme music and production for this podcast is done by Thrill Me Music. You can find more information about her work at thrillmemusic.squarespace.com. Kaylee, where can our listeners find you?
People can find me on Twitter at WitchesHex, that's WITCHS Hex, and if you want to follow SoulSync's development, you can follow SoulSync on Twitter as well, at SoulSyncGame, that's SOULSYNC Game. I'm currently naming NPCs after people who quote tweet a tweet. I'm probably just going to leave that offer up forever, so if you want a chance at that, go for it.
Yeah, go have yourself put in a video game. Sort of. At least
potentially.
Your name, maybe. You should. It's fun. Then you can play the game and be like, that's me. Or at least someone who has my name. And hey, if you have a really uncommon name, you can be like, yeah, that's basically me. And if you have a really common name, you can be like, I know that's a common name, but like, no, that's me.
I have not gotten any duplicate names at time of recording.
And you can find me on Twitch and Twitter as Double Gear SYS, as in Double Gear System. And you can find my Final Fantasy XIV virtual photography stuff at Instagram.com/echo_white. That's EKHO_white. If you go there now, you will actually not find Echo, because we are currently in the middle of what I have unofficially dubbed the hashtag Shimo takeover, because I made a new character and her name is Shimo and I'm obsessed with her. So there's a bunch of pictures of her right now. So if you got bored of looking at Echo but still want to see virtual photography stuff, Shimo takeover is happening and she's wonderful. So, in continuation of Author Month that spreads over the back half of one month and continues into the front half of the next month, our next episode is going to be with Jackson Bird, a YouTube vlogger and author of upcoming memoir, Sorted. Looking forward to that. Looking forward to the continuation of Setting the Record Queer Book Club. Remember, you owe me a 4-page literary analysis by the time this episode comes out, because that's how that works. Time is fake. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you in 2 weeks for the continuation of Author Month.
Bye.